When HO Karen demanded I move my boat, she had no idea my waterfront deed was about to sink her entire plan. Picture this: a serene lake in suburban Austin, Texas, my pride and joy boat bobbing gently at my private dock, and then, bam, a letter from the neighborhood's self-appointed dictator, Karen Mitchell, demanding I hide my vessel to preserve her precious community aesthetic. Ever had an HOA try to control your property or hobbies? Share your worst OA story in the comments. I'm Jack Thompson, a 55-year-old retired engineer, and this is the story of how I turned Karen's overreach into her own personal shipwreck. Let me set the scene. After 30 years of crunching numbers and dodging deadlines, I cashed out my engineering career and bought my dream home, a waterfront gem on Lake Travis, complete with a private pier that practically begged for a boat. This wasn't just any house. It was my retirement sanctuary, a place where I could kick back, crack a beer, and watch the sunset glint off the water. The boat, a sleek 22-foot fishing rig I named Real Escape, was the cherry on top. I'd spent months restoring it, sanding down every inch until it shone like my own personal trophy. That dock and that boat, they weren't just property. They were freedom. Now enter Karen Mitchell, the HOA president of the glitzy Lakeside Estates, a development that sprouted up a few years after my house was built. Karen's the kind of person who'd measure your grass with a ruler and send you a violation notice if it's half an inch too long. She's got a clipboard, a perm, and a vendetta against anything that doesn't scream suburban perfection. Her Oz notorious for terrorizing residents with rules about mailbox colors, fence heights, and, God forbid, visible trash cans. But here's the kicker: my property isn't even part of her HOA. My home predates her little empire, and my deed makes that crystal clear. Karen, though, she doesn't let pesky details like jurisdiction stop her. It all started on a crisp spring morning in 2025. I was sipping coffee on my deck, watching Real Escape sway in the breeze, when my mailbox pinned with a certified letter. I figured it was a utility bill or maybe a neighbor's misdelivered Amazon package. Nope, it was a 3-page manifesto from Lakeside Estates HOA, signed by Karen herself, demanding I remove my boat from my own dock. Why? Apparently, it violated their community aesthetic standards. The letter droned on about unsightly watercraft and how my boat was lowering the neighborhood's prestige. I laughed so hard I nearly spilled my coffee. My boat? Unsightly? This thing was cleaner than Karen's bleached teeth. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the letter like it was a bad joke. My property's been here since before Lakeside Estates was a twinkle in a developer's eye. My dock's been jutting into Lake Travis since Karen was probably still in high school. And yet here she was, trying to flex her HO muscle over a boat that's legally parked on my private pier. I could have ignored it, maybe framed the letter for laughs, but something about Karen's tone, her sheer audacity, lit a spark in me. I wasn't just going to roll over. I was going to make sure she regretted ever putting my name on her radar. Now, I'm not the type to pick fights. I'm the guy who waves at neighbors, grills burgers for the block party, and keeps his lawn mowed just enough to avoid complaints. But Karen's letter wasn't just an annoyance, it was an invasion. My boat's more than a hobby. It's my escape, my reward for decades of grinding through spreadsheets and meetings. And my dock, that's my turf, backed by a deed that's older than her HOA's rulebook. I knew I had something she didn't leverage. Somewhere in my home office, buried in a fireproof safe, was the original waterfront deed to this property. I hadn't looked at it in years, but I remembered enough to know it mentioned riparian rights, fancy legal talk for my right to use the lake, dock included. Karen thought she could bully me into submission, but she didn't know Jack Thompson. I spent my career solving problems, from busted machinery to budget overruns, and I wasn't about to let some HOA tyrant ruin my retirement vibe. Her letter was the opening shot in a war she didn't realize she'd started. I folded it up, tucked it into my desk, and started plotting. Step 1: confirm my deed's fine print. Step 2, figure out how to make Karen eat her own bylaws. Step 3. Well, let's just say I was already picturing her face when she realized she'd sailed straight into my trap. So, buckle up, because this isn't just a story about a boat or a dock. It's about standing your ground when some overbearing HOA thinks they own you. It's about the little guy outsmarting the bureaucratic bully, and doing it with a grin. Stick around to see how I used my waterfront deed to sink Karen's plan faster than a lead anchor. And hey, if you've got an HOA horror story of your own, drop it below. Let's commiserate, and maybe plot a few more victories. It all began with a letter about my dock. That crisp spring morning in 2025, when I pulled Karen Mitchell's HOA manifesto from my mailbox, I didn't just see a petty demand to move my boat. I saw a gauntlet thrown down. My waterfront home on Lake Travis, with its private pier and my gleaming real escape bobbing in the water, wasn't just a place to live. It was my hard-earned slice of paradise, a testament to years of grinding through engineering projects. That boat, docked proudly at my pier, was my ticket to freedom. My way of saying, Jack Thompson's done punching clocks. And now Karen and her Lakeside Estates HOA thought they could waltz in and dictate what I did with it. Not on my watch. Let me paint you a picture of why this dock matters. My house, a sturdy 2-story with wide windows and a wraparound deck, sits right on the edge of Lake Travis. The pier stretches out like an old friend's handshake, solid and reliable. Built long before Karen's HOA started slapping covenants on every blade of grass. Every weekend, I'm out there on real escape, slicing through the lake's glassy surface, fishing rod in hand or just drifting with the radio playing some Willie Nelson. It's not just a boat, it's my ritual, my reset button. After decades of deadlines, this is how I reclaim my time. So when that letter landed, claiming my boat was an unsightly watercraft that needed to be hidden away, it wasn't just an annoyance, it was personal. The letter itself was a masterpiece of bureaucratic nonsense, 3 pages of self-righteous drivel stamped with the Lakeside Estates HOA logo. Karen cited some obscure bylaw about maintaining community aesthetic standards, insisting that my boat's presence on my own dock was dragging down the neighborhood's vibe. She demanded I store it out of sight, maybe in a garage or some off-site lot, within 7 days, or face further action. I could practically hear her smug tone through the ink, like she was already patting herself on the back for saving the lake from my hideous 22-foot fishing rig. I sat at my kitchen table, rereading it, my coffee going cold. My first instinct was to crumple it up and toss it in the trash. But then I thought, let's see how far Karen wants to take this. I fired off a polite but firm response, typing it up in my home office with real escape visible through the window. I explained that my property predates her HOA, that my dock and boat are fully within my rights, and that her bylaws don't apply to me. I hit send expecting that'd be the end of it. Big mistake. 2 days later, I got a reply from Karen, dripping with condescension. She claimed the HOA's aesthetic rules applied to all properties in the neighborhood, member or not, because my boat's visual impact affected their property values. She even had the gall to suggest I attend their next board meeting to discuss compliance. Compliance. I wasn't complying with Jack. Now, I'm no lawyer, but I know a shakedown when I see one. HOAs like Karen's love to throw their weight around, banking on people caving to avoid the hassle. I'd read enough horror stories online. Folks fined for planting the wrong flowers or parking their own cars in their own driveways, to know this was classic overreach. In fact, studies show HOAs often stretch their rules beyond legal bounds, especially when it comes to non-members like me. Bankrate HOA violations. My property's deed, locked in my safe, was my ace in the hole. I hadn't dug into it yet, but I remembered enough from when I bought the place. It mentioned riparian rights, which meant I could use the lake however I damn well pleased, including docking my boat. Karen's letter wasn't just a demand, it was a declaration of war. She thought she could bully me into submission, but she didn't know who she was dealing with. I wasn't some newbie homeowner, intimidated by her clipboard. I'd spent my career outsmarting problems bigger than her ego, faulty designs, budget cuts, you name it. This was just another puzzle to solve. I tucked the letter into a folder in my desk, right next to my property records, and started thinking strategy. Step 1, pull that deed and see exactly what it said. Step 2, figure out how to make Karen's own rules bite her in the ass. The tension was building, and I could feel it. Every time I looked out at real escape, gleaming under the Texas sun, I got a little more determined. This wasn't just about a boat anymore. It was about standing up to an overbearing HOA that thought it could steamroll anyone in its path. Karen had no idea what she'd stirred up, but she was about to find out. I wasn't moving my boat. Not today, not ever. And if she wanted to push this, I'd be ready with a surprise she'd never see coming. Then Karen turned up the heat. After I shot down her condescending demand to discuss compliance about my boat, I figured she'd back off, maybe lick her wounds and move on to harassing someone about their unapproved mailbox color. But Karen Mitchell, president of the Lakeside Estates HOA, wasn't the retreating type. She doubled down, and what started as a petty letter about my dock on Lake Travis became a full-on bureaucratic bully campaign to force my real escape off my private pier. Big mistake, Karen. You just poked a retired engineer who loves a challenge. It started with a new email, this one marked, "You are gent," in screaming red letters. The HOA, apparently undeterred by my response that my waterfront property was outside their jurisdiction, had decided to hit me where it hurts my wallet. They were slapping me with daily fines, $50 a pop for my boat's ongoing violation of their aesthetic bylaws. The email warned that if I didn't remove real escape from my dock within 72 hours, they'd escalate to legal action. Legal action over a boat that's been on my pier since before their HOA was a twinkle in a developer's eye. I couldn't help but laugh. Karen thought she was the captain of this lake. My deed says otherwise. I saved the email to a growing folder in my home office, right next to her original letter and my property records. Each fine notification, another one pinged my inbox the next day, felt like a dare. Did Karen really think I'd cave? I'd spent 30 years solving problems under pressure, from busted pipelines to million-dollar overruns. A clipboard-wielding HOA president wasn't going to scare me, but I wasn't about to play her game on instinct alone. If she wanted a fight, I'd come prepared, and that meant getting my ducks in a row. I called up Tom Reynolds, a real estate lawyer I'd met at a neighborhood barbecue a few years back. Tom's the kind of guy who can explain zoning laws while flipping a burger, and I trusted him to cut through Karen's nonsense. I swung by his office with my waterfront deed, a yellowed document I'd fished out of my safe, and the HOA's latest threats. Tom spread the deed across his desk, squinting at the fine print through his bifocals. "Jack," he said, a grin creeping across his face, "you've got gold here." He pointed to a section about riparian rights, legal jargon that boiled down to one glorious fact. My property came with ironclad privileges to use Lake Travis, including docking my boat on my private pier. No HOA could touch that. But Tom wasn't done. He pulled up the Lakeside Estates HOA bylaws, which he'd snagged from a public database. Flipping through the pages, he found a gem, a clause exempting waterfront properties from certain aesthetic rules, like the one Karen was using to justify her crusade. Apparently, when the HOA was formed, the developers knew better than to mess with lakefront owners and their docks. Karen either didn't read her own rulebook, or thought she could bluff her way through. Either way, she'd sailed straight into a legal minefield. "This," Tom said, tapping the bylaws, "is your torpedo." Armed with this, I started planning my counterattack. The fines were piling up, 150 by day 3, all documented in my inbox, but they were just numbers on a screen. Tom assured me they wouldn't hold up in court, not with my deed and the HOA's own bylaws on my side. Still, I didn't want to just defend myself. I wanted to turn Karen's overreach into her undoing. I pictured her smug face when she realized her authority was about to crash and burn. Step 1. Let her think she was winning. Step 2. Hit her with the truth at the perfect moment. Step 3. Watch her squirm. This wasn't just about my boat anymore. It was about every homeowner who'd ever been steamrolled by an HOA's power trip. I'd read how waterfront owners often win these battles thanks to riparian rights, which grant specific water use privileges cottage property issues. Karen's HOA was banking on me folding under pressure, but they didn't know Jack Thompson. I'd spent my career outsmarting bigger bullies than her. Corporate suits, faulty designs, you name it. Now, with Tom's legal ammo and my deed as a shield, I was ready to make her regret ever sending that first letter. The stage was set, and Karen was about to walk right into my trap. That's when I sprang my trap. For weeks, Karen Mitchell and her Lakeside Estates OA had been tightening the screws, piling on daily fines and threats of legal action to force my real escape off my private pier on Lake Travis. They thought they could bully me into submission, but they didn't know Jack Thompson. Armed with my waterfront deeds, riparian rights, and a killer clause in the HOA's own bylaws, I was ready to flip the script. Karen, you sailed into the wrong harbor with this one. I decided to play nice, at least on the surface. I sent Karen an email, all polite and conciliatory, inviting her and the HOA board to a mediation at my house to resolve the matter. I even threw in a line about wanting to be a good neighbor. Tom Reynolds, my real estate lawyer, nearly choked on his coffee when I told him the plan. You're luring them into a legal ambush, he said, grinning. Damn right I was. I set the meeting for a Saturday afternoon, making sure my dock and real escape were in full view from my deck. If Karen wanted to make my boat the hill she died on, I'd give her a front row seat. The day of the mediation, I prepped like I was defending $1 million project. I laid out my waterfront deed, the HOA bylaws, and a recorded statement from Tom on my dining room table, all organized like evidence in a courtroom. My home office printer had been working overtime, spitting out copies of the key documents for each board member. I even polished real escape until it gleamed under the Texas sun, a silent middle finger to Karen's unsightly watercraft nonsense. By the time the HOA crew arrived, Karen in the lead, clutching her clipboard like a shield, I was ready. Karen swept in with 3 board members in tow, all decked out in business casual like they were about to close a real estate deal. I offered coffee and pastries, keeping the vibe friendly, but I could see Karen's smirk. She thought I was about to cave. Jack, she started, we're glad you're ready to work with us on the boat issue. I smiled, nodding, and let her ramble about community standards for a good 5 minutes. Then I stood up, walked to the table, and dropped the hammer. Ladies and gentlemen, I said, sliding copies of my deed across the table, let's talk about riparian rights. I walked them through the document, highlighting the section that guaranteed my legal right to dock real escape on my private pier. Karen's smirk faded as I explained how these rights, tied to my waterfront property, predated her HOA and trumped any aesthetic rule she could dream up. Then I hit them with the knockout punch, the HOA's own bylaws. I pointed to the clause exempting waterfront properties from the very aesthetic standards she was trying to enforce. Karen, I said, leaning back in my chair, your rulebook says my dock's none of your business. The room went quiet. One board member, a guy named Steve who looked like he'd rather be golfing, started flipping through the bylaws, his brow furrowing. Karen tried to rally, stammering about neighborhood harmony and visual impact. But I wasn't done. I played Tom's recorded statement on my phone, his calm voice laying out how the HOA's fines were baseless and their threats unenforceable. You've been fining me for a right I legally hold, I said, tapping the stack of fine notices I'd printed out. That stops today. Karen's face was a mix of shock and fury, like a kid who just realized the game was rigged. She tried one last argument, claiming the HOA could still pursue legal action, but Steve cut her off. "Karen, we need to review this," he said, holding up the bylaws. The other board members nodded, clearly rattled. I leaned forward, keeping my tone light but firm. "I'm happy to keep my boat right where it is. But if you want to waste your budget on a losing lawsuit, be my guest. Checkmate." As they shuffled out, Karen avoided eye contact, her clipboard dangling limply. I stood on my deck watching them drive off, Real Escape bobbing proudly behind me. This wasn't just a win for me. It was a middle finger to every HOA that thinks it can steamroll people with fake authority. I'd read how HOA bylaws often have loopholes, especially for unique properties like mine. And Karen had walked right into one fund HOA law case law. She thought she held all the cards, but my deed and her own rules sank her plan faster than a storm on Lake Travis. Now, it was time to see how she'd handle the fallout, and just like that the HOA sank, after I dropped the legal bombshell of my waterfront deed and the Lakeside Estate's own bylaws in that so-called mediation. At my house, Karen Mitchell and her HOA board scurried off my deck like rats abandoning a sinking ship. They thought they could bully me into hiding my real escape from my private pier on Lake Travis, but my riparian rights and their overlooked exemption clause turned their campaign into a spectacular flop. Now, it was time for the defeated association to face the music, and for me, Jack Thompson, to savor the victory. A week after the meeting, the HOA sent an email that was music to my ears, signed by the entire board. Karen's name conspicuously last. They withdrew all fines, canceled their demand to move my boat, and promised no further action. Better yet, they announced a public apology at the next community meeting, scheduled for the following Saturday. I leaned back in my home office chair, Real Escape gleaming through the window, and grinned. Karen's clipboard empire had crumbled, and I hadn't even needed to set foot in a courtroom. Tom Reynolds, my lawyer, called it a textbook takedown. I called it justice with a side of satisfaction. The community meeting was held at the Lakeside Estates Clubhouse, a glass-walled building that screamed overpriced HO dues. I showed up, not because I had to, but because I wasn't about to miss Karen eating crow. The room was packed with neighbors, many of whom had their own gripes with the HOA's petty rules. When Karen took the podium, her usual smugness was gone, replaced by a tight-lipped grimace. After a review of legal documents, she read from a prepared statement. "We've determined that Mr. Thompson's boat complies with his property rights and is exempt from our aesthetic bylaws." The crowd murmured, a mix of surprise and amusement. A guy in the back row whispered loud enough for everyone to hear, "Karen, next time, check the deed before you start a war." The room erupted in chuckles, and I couldn't help but smirk. What happened next was even better. Neighbors I'd barely spoken to before started clapping me on the back, thanking me for standing up to the HOA's overreach. One woman, who'd been fined for her kid's basketball hoop, called me the lake's new hero. Another guy, a retiree like me, said he'd been itching to challenge Karen's rules, but never had the ammo. My waterfront deed, it turned out, wasn't just my shield. It was a rallying cry for everyone fed up with the HOA's nonsense. I'd read how waterfront deeds often give owners the upper hand in these fights. HOA leader. Calm, but seeing it spark a mini rebellion. That was the cherry on top. To celebrate, I decided to throw a Lake Day bash at my dock. I sent out invites to the whole neighborhood. Yes, even Karen, because nothing says victory like magnanimity. The following weekend, my backyard was buzzing with dozens of neighbors, kids splashing in the lake, and grills firing up burgers. Real Escape bobbed proudly at the pier, the star of the show, as folks snapped selfies with it like it was a local legend. I was handing out sodas when I spotted Karen slinking in, dressed down in a plain blouse, her clipboard nowhere in sight. She gave me a curt nod, grabbed a plate of potato salad, and stuck to the sidelines. A neighbor sidled up to me, nodding toward her. "Look at that," he said with a grin. "The queen of the HOA, humbled by a boat. I laughed so hard I nearly dropped my tongues. As the sun set over Lake Travis, painting the water gold, I stood on my deck, watching the crowd enjoy the lake I'd fought to keep free. This wasn't just about my boat or my dock. It was about reminding everyone that no HOA, no matter how self-important, gets to trample your rights. My waterfront deed had sunk Karen's plan, but it was the community's support that made the victory sweet. So, if you love this HOA takedown, hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell for more stories of justice and laughs. And if you've got your own tale of sticking it to a nosy HOA, drop it in the comments. Let's keep the rebellion rolling.